We're discussing the politics of the newsroom. Basically, we want to understand the ongoing changes in the media landscape in print and television. To what extent are these just a function of the fact that consumer interests are changing, and to what extent is this a function of the fact that owners of new media are imposing their own vision, often political vision, on journalists? We've seen what's going on at ETV, we've seen what's happening at the independent news media print outlets for several years now. We as OSF, of course, support all of the initiatives that will be speaking tonight, and we're particularly interested in how we save independent journalism as a way to promote open society values, a society in which access to information is freely available to all and freedom of expression is guaranteed.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to OSF for hosting this important discussion. I'm going to try and trace some of what I see as the background to the current issues in the media and my understanding of what's happening briefly, and then hopefully later, if there are any questions, I'll happily respond to them. But I think it's important first to see that the critical background is the financial pressures facing all the traditional media around the world and in South Africa. And in particular, in our newspaper industry. I don't know if people saw yesterday's Audit Bureau circulation figures released on our newspapers, but they were quite shocking. And it represents the latest in a series of a kind of downward spiral in newspaper sales. The Star, the flagship of the independent group, is down to 84,000, which is well less than half what it was only a few years ago. And actually another part of the background we discovered when the ETV story burst into the open because of a boardroom dispute was the fight that's going on over set-top boxes, which proves to be quite important in the relationship of television to the state. I think it's important to see that, you know, the ANC has been complaining for some time about the hostility and the criticism it gets from the media. But it's had limited progress in what I would call its big stick approach. And by that I mean the threat of a media tribunal and the so-called secrecy bill, the Protection of State Information Bill, which notably is still sitting somewhere in the presidency and isn't enacted. And the media tribunal it's there, but it's on the back burner. I think one also has to see that we live in a time when all the institutions of accountability in our democracy, the constitutional and other institutions that are critical to accountability in our democracy, are under pressure. Some are functioning poorly, but all are under some kind of quite worrying degree of pressure. Particularly those that show much independence of view. And I think that ranges from Parliament through to the judiciary and clearly through to the public protector. And you know, the private media, for all its issues and its problems, is the one institution of accountability that's least susceptible to direct ruling party and state intervention. And I think it's important to have that as part of the background, to see the particularly important role that the private media in particular plays as an institution of accountability when all of them seem to be under significant pressure. You know, we've had a pretty lively and pretty outspoken media. And we've had a particular strength in investigative journalism. I know I watch investigative journalism around the world, and particularly in the global south, quite closely. And there are few countries which have as much strong, powerful, good investigative journalism as we have had in this country in the last 10 years in particular. And sometimes we feel that it doesn't have much impact, but it's worth reminding ourselves that the last 2 commissioners of police are no longer in the job, and one went to prison because of investigative journalists. It's worth reminding ourselves that the arms deal remains a national issue because of investigative journalists, and of course Nkandla remains a central political issue only because journalists have stuck with it for, what, 5 years now, or even more. But the financial situation I've described makes the media particularly vulnerable to outside pressures which can compromise independence. And I think you're seeing signs of those kinds of pressures in all sorts of ways. But certainly we've seen a spate of indications of independence in newsrooms under pressure in the last while. And I think it's important just to outline the kind of nature of that. At independent newspapers, a lot has been said about that, so I won't dwell on it, but it has, my understanding is that the deal put together to take control of independent newspaper was in fact broken by key ANC people, putting together public money in the PIC, Chinese financial backers, and the choice of a South African empowerment partner. And the effect of that ownership seems to have been to put enormous pressure on any show of independence in those newsrooms. There's been a clearing out at some newspapers, particularly the Cape Times. And I'm talking about this because I think you can't. Because you have to be more careful. I've just been told there's 3 reporters remaining at the Cape Times, which is just horrifying. But it's been quite striking who's been and being forced out of the Cape Times. Because I think some of it is done under the guise of transformation. But you have to ask, transformation to what? Because certainly my impression is that anyone who shows any degree of independence or criticism is being pushed out quite sharply. The New Age newspaper, I think, is significant. It was, I think, it was a good addition to our diversity of voice in the media. But I think the important thing there is to see that it's selling so few copies that they're not auditing the circulation. And not auditing the circulation means there can be no argument for state advertising, for public service advertising, because if you're going to make sure you spend that money properly and carefully, it's got to be based on who your readership is. If you're not even subjecting that to audit, then I'm not sure how you can present any argument for public service or state advertising. But we're seeing huge and extravagant sponsorship of breakfasts. And I think this is important to highlight, because what I think is we're seeing a pattern under these financial circumstances of the state and the ANC using advertising and sponsorship from state bodies and parastatals to support media that they think is less critical, more sympathetic, and to isolate media they see as too critical. And I see it as, I think we're seeing an important shift in strategy in dealing with the media. So it's moving from the big stick to the carrot in the big stick. In the sense that it's more subtle, it's more insidious, and I think the essence of it is a use of the power and authority the ANC has by virtue of being ruling party and its access to the state and state resources to try and influence owners and editors. Now, there's nothing wrong with trying to influence owners and editors. Everyone does it. It's part of the game. So I don't want to suggest that there's anything necessarily wrong with trying to do that. But where I think we have to watch carefully is in the increasing sign of the use of state resources to do that. Because I think that's very worrying. And that's clearly, if people are sponsoring overpriced celebrity breakfasts with a newspaper, or moving their advertising systematically to a newspaper even though there's no audited circulation figures, and they're doing it for political reasons, that's clearly unconstitutional. It's clearly illegal, as I see it, in terms of the expenditure of state money. So I think it's something we have to watch very closely. And I think the overall impact of this is that the space for independent journalism is shrinking. It's under pressure. We see it's threatened at ETV. We see it threatened at independent newspapers. It's long since suffered at the SABC. And I have the sense that this is a trend we're going to see growing and spreading, enabled by the tough economic, financial climate in which much of this media finds itself. Where do I find hope? I do want to end by saying that I see hope in resisting, in keeping independent spaces open, in keeping critical accountability journalism alive and active and present in three things. The first and most important place, I think, is those in newsrooms who resist, who try and look after their independence, who try and draw a line. And this happens importantly. I think it is a very important element in the keeping open of independent activity under apartheid. I've been hearing about a kind of middle management of SABC News trying to draw a line and trying to say this far and no further in very difficult circumstances. And there was a particular confrontation before the elections, I understand, where news management across the SABC said, we're drawing this line, and forced interfering management to back off at least a little bit and temporarily. And I place great importance and faith in editors and journalists who look after their own independence. In an ideal world, managers and owners are there to defend their backs, but I think we've learned you can't rely on that. What you can rely on is that there's always some journalists who are prepared to stand up for it. Very quickly then, I think there's an increasing number of voices on the margins, outside of the big groups, who are playing an important role in saying certain things and pursuing certain things. And that's enabled by the third factor, which of course is technology. Technology always enables alternative voices to find their place and challenge those in traditional mainstream media. It happened in the 50s, it happened in the 80s. And clearly the internet is going to provide that space when we look to the future and the ways in which we look after and hopefully grow the independent space. Thank you.
I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what Anton has said from the perspective of someone who's worked in one of these media groups. But much of what I say, I think, is attributable to most of the others also, certainly in print. So you should remember that it was just 3 years ago in November 2011 that editors from all over the country came to Parliament wearing black to mark the passing of the secrecy bill. And many of us suggested at the time that the threat to press freedom was not only from the outside but from the inside, and that if we were going to dress up in black to mourn the passing of that bill, we should perhaps also mourn the slow destruction of our newsrooms in the name of profit. At the time I was working for the Cape Times, And in a document prepared for the Media Workers Association of South Africa, it was estimated that the Irish owners of Independent, which, as you know, also publishes the Cape Argus, the Star, the Pretoria News, the Mercury, and a host of other newspapers, the owners had made operating profits of more than 4 billion rand on an initial investment of 725 million or less. The numbers are estimates because for most of that time it wasn't a listed company, but careful research suggested that. So 4 billion rand on an initial investment of 725 million. Now they did that over the 18 or so years of their ownership by cutting all possible costs, in the good years and in the bad years. Posts were frozen or restructured, newsrooms shrank, operations were centralized. And the results, which Anton has touched on, are that junior reporters are sent on tricky stories, which in the past only experienced reporters would have tackled. Cuts in production teams, especially the sub-editing function, mean that the old systems of checks and balances have been eroded and mistakes creep in. And the demographic transformation of newsrooms is slowed as vacant posts are frozen. You have to wait for people to leave before you can make new appointments, and in many cases you can't because the posts are frozen. But the main problem is that since the news doesn't shrink, smaller newsrooms mean that either the reporters cover more stories or that some stories don't get told. Deadline-driven, overworked reporters resort to phone reporting, and they pay more attention to those with the resources to make themselves heard, and less attention to everyone else, until finally some voices are drowned out altogether. When Independent was bought by a South African consortium last year, many of us hoped that the new owners would change that trajectory. And of course I don't work there any longer, but from what I can see, that's not happened. And what investment there has been in repackaging rather than in collecting information. In fact, some of the last parts of the old system which survived the Irish destruction have since been destroyed. Now, I'd like to say again, this trend is not specific to Independent. There are cost-cutting pressures everywhere, especially since the financial crisis of 2008. And I sometimes think that what's happening in the media is a little bit analogous to what happened in the financial services industry, in fact, and which led to that crisis. In other words, the creation of all sorts of complex financial products, the repackaging of debt through derivatives and options on derivatives and so on, means that compared to the actual number of goods and services circulating in the real world, actually the financial services market is much bigger than the market in real goods and services. This is what I see happening a little bit in the media, that we package and repackage on different platforms all the time a very small amount of information. Instead of gathering more information, we use those little bits and we repackage them in different ways. And that's very dangerous for exactly the same reasons that it was dangerous in the financial markets. Now, there are obviously still some examples around of brilliant journalism. Some of the people who work in those places are here tonight. But on the whole, what is happening is that information which is less and less comprehensive and less reliable is repackaged in different ways on different platforms. And the public is in danger of being less and less informed, with very serious consequences for our democracy. At the same time, there's a new political threat, which Anton has also outlined, a very deliberate and often explicit attempt by those close to the ruling party to take control of the media, a process which Anton described very well in a recent column. Rhodes academic Jane Duncan calls it neutralization from within. So it's this shift in tactics. New owners appoint editors and journalists who can be relied on to tell the story as those in authority think it should be told. That's what's happening in much, not all, much of our print and digital media, and it spells the end of good journalism in those newsrooms, at least for now. I saw a tweet after Ben Bradley died, the legendary editor of the Washington Post, and I've tried to find it again, and I can't remember now whether it came from Bob Woodward or Carl Bernstein, the Watergate journalist that everybody knows about. But whoever it was that said it, he said that he was proud to have been one of the people Bradley set loose every day. And I really like that phrase, set loose, because that's what you have to do with journalists, reporters and photographers. You have to set them loose. They have to go out and find what there is to find, and they have to feel free to report it. If they set out to look for what they think the owners or the editors want them to find, they would do better to stay at home. In the context of the disciplinary charges of insubordination against my former colleague Tony Weaver, Anton has written about the importance of employing insubordinate rather than subordinate journalists. He's charged with insubordination, and I think this is a very good point. We need insubordinate journalists. We do not need subordinate journalists. And another little anecdote, in my office at the Cape Times, the reporter sitting immediately outside it had stuck on the glass wall between us just 2 words, a little bumper sticker she'd found somewhere. Question authority, it said. And a couple of my, the people that I reported to said, how can you let her stick that there? It looks like she's questioning your authority. I didn't think she was, but I wouldn't have minded if she did. Because I think if journalists have got to come up with a slogan of only 2 words, that's a very good one. Question authority. So, and we should not fool ourselves that owners' attempts to interfere in newsrooms directly or through the people that they appoint are aimed at transformation, or that they're about diversity in news coverage. No. This is all about what it's always been about, profits. The only difference is that now there's a direct link between profits and party loyalty through the mechanisms of crony capitalism. And we should not fool ourselves that it doesn't matter. It does. At a time when there's increasing contestation of the political and economic order, and an increasingly authoritarian response to that contestation, what Jane Duncan has called the de-democratization of society. Accurate, careful, comprehensive reporting is more important, probably than at any time since 1994.
We only made one exception ever to allow PowerPoint, and that's what I
So I actually only learned to use PowerPoint 2 weeks ago. I've got 2 presentations in 2 weeks, so I know this thing is the devil, and I prepared basically 3 slides, and it's just to show you in a visual way, which would be a lot harder and take a lot longer to present verbally. I want to talk about the catch-22 that investigative journalism faces under the prevailing conditions where, print, I'm talking particularly print, because that's kind of where traditionally investigative journalism has been, most focused and most effective. How declining circulation and falling advertising revenues has left what is an expensive, time-consuming, difficult, and quite frankly, not results-orientated type of journalism, in the kind of corporate bottom line sense, in a catch-22. And how we at amaBhungane, the MNG Centre for Investigative Journalism, were both formed as a reaction to this 4.5 years ago now, and the kind of thinking we're doing around the future and what the situation now holds, and where things can take us. So, first of all, the bad news. And the bad news, very simply, looks like that. This is UK newspaper circulation figures published by the Audit Bureau Circulations of the UK. And I'm not going to dwell it in any detail. It's absolutely self-explanatory, but the only way is south. Is the situation in South Africa any different? The answer, and I promise you this is slideshow 2 of 3, is no. You might perhaps notice that the decline is perhaps less precipitous than in a first world economy like the UK, but that nevertheless, across the publications kind of stacked on top of each other here, and in total reflecting a kind of a total readership of just shy of 9 million. In 5 short years, that's declined by maybe 25% in terms of circulation. That red line, second from the bottom, is the Mail and Guardian, which looks like it's holding steady. But as Anton mentioned, the Audit Bureau's most recent November figures that were out yesterday, the MNG's taken a shocking tumble. It's down to below 40,000 copies a week for the first time in, I don't know, but possibly a very, very, very long time. I started the Mail and Guardian in 2010, and I clearly remember there were kind of groans and grumbles about the circulation being at about 53,000. That was a rubbish edition. And for the first time, we've kind of plummeted through the ice, and into the kind of freezing waters of kind of below 40,000, and it's only going to get colder. And while the physical products that we sell, we're not being able to sell those, the other problem is that revenues are also deserting what we do. So in this chart, broken down by advertising revenue and circulation revenue, you can see that between now and 2018, as predicted or projected by PricewaterhouseCoopers in a report they produced earlier this year called the South African Entertainment and Media Outlook, basically, print advertising revenue and print circulation revenue is going to grow at 2 to 5%. That's nowhere near even inflation. And while the outlook for digital revenue from digital publishing, advertising generated of digital publication, and indeed the sale of digital editions, Kindle editions, iPad editions, etc., is growing quickly, but off a tiny base. And ultimately, the catch-22 that we're faced is that the old model is broken. Nobody knows what the new model looks like, let alone how it's going to pay for anything. And the biggest problem that we face is the fact that what we do, which is the production of original investigative content, playing a watchdog role, holding power to account in the public interest, that, like I said earlier, is expensive. It's time-consuming. You aren't guaranteed results. To give you a kind of snapshot of my journalistic production, I probably, in a good month, produce one big investigative story, and maybe a couple of kind of follow-ups. But that is not going to please the bean counters, for whom revenues and circulation and everything is dropping through the floor. So, what can be done? As you can see from the figures that I put up on the slideshow just now, this is obviously a problem that kind of the avalanche on the slide has happened earlier in first world countries, and there have obviously been reactions there. There's the kind of New York Times response, which is to put up a paywall and to actually charge people for the excellent content that they produce, and it's been quite successful, but it still doesn't meet the cost of their production. Another model is the Guardian model, which is to throw everything open and to garner as big a readership as possible, to kind of place themselves as the foremost, serious, global, online, in-depth publication. But they're doing that pretty much drawing off an endowment of a trust that's been built up over the better part of 80 years, and galloping through that money really, really quickly, and it's not clear what they're going to do when that money runs out, in maybe 2 or 3 years' time. So, mixed results and an uncertain future around the model of kind of doing what we've always done, but trying to monetize it either through, paywalls and stuff like that, or through kind of digital advertising. Another kind of trend that one is seeing internationally is kind of the rise of very niche or specialized websites, etc. So, examples include Politico, which is a kind of American kind of pop politics type website. One that we're a big fan of at amaBhungane, ProPublica, and that's kind of on the model that we are, which is a kind of a donor-funded investigative non-profit model. But the likelihood of a model like that working in South Africa, if it was purely to be funded commercially, is not high. South African businesses are typically timid. They typically do not step out of line. You'll remember FNB getting smacked down for an ad a year or two back. So, can like a niche specialist investigative website work in South Africa without donor funding? Probably not. In this catch-22, different publications in South Africa have reacted in different ways, but there is kind of a gold thread running through all of them, and that they're all subsidized in one way or another by something else. So, certainly not claiming them to be investigative, but the SABC, New Age, and the independent titles under the new owners are all in one way or another kind of subsidized by the state. And whereas in, for example, some of the Nordic countries, that works pretty well, and the state does fund independent media, that works great. But the kind of master's voice tendency in South Africa, that's not something that we've been able to get away from. Another kind of cross-subsidization that we're seeing is the kind of cross-subsidization, of a media group's newspaper side by other revenue-generating things. So, for example, the Media 24 Naspers model, where their newspaper group is actually a tiny component of their overall kind of turnover and revenue, and it basically survives at the pleasure of the owner there, who pretty much would fund it through vast revenues gained elsewhere. The same applies to Times Media. There's also the Caxton model, which is basically to exit the field of any serious journalism whatsoever and kind of go knock and drop kind of community level publications. At the Mail and Guardian, and in keeping with Alide's and Anton's kind of glowing hope for resistance in newsrooms, the whole native advertising proposal was played out and was fought against pretty strongly by the journalists there. Native advertising is basically paid for advertising masquerading as legitimate news production. And there are many ways to do it and many ways to slice it up, but ultimately, to me and to many of my colleagues, it's the ultimate form of deceit. You are basically, dressing mutton up as lamb and selling it as such. And it's a real slippery slope when readers no longer become sure, what the motivation is behind, any given story. And the whole point about native advertising is the advertising element is basically buried or hidden. And for now, thank goodness, what seemed maybe a year ago to be a Mail and Guardian move towards kind of cross-subsidizing our falling advertising revenues with this has kind of been placed on ice. So that kind of brings us to the donor-funded investigative non-profit model, which amaBhungane was the first in South Africa to do, but in a context of a kind of explosion of this kind of thing across the world. So in 2007, there were 37 such kind of donor-funded non-profit operations. In 2012, that's almost quadrupled to 106. To give you a little bit of context, when we started out in 2010, the Mail and Guardian contributed about 65% of amaBhungane's operational budget, and another 35% was sourced from donors. Carefully over the last 4 years, we've actually inversely turned that around. So now amaBhungane is funded 65% by donor funding, and 35% by the Mail and Guardian, which is not to say that the Mail and Guardian's contributed less. It hasn't declined in real terms. We've just gone out and sourced and diversified our donor pool. And in fact, one of our most long-standing donor supporters are the Open Society Foundation. This model has its challenges. Stefan's, my boss, sitting at the back, is actually going to work through tonight to complete a donor application for the following year. It comes with an incredible amount of admin. You know, before journalists shut down their computers and went home and some other donor. You know, and that's a cross that Stefan's now has to bear. You know, year on year, you know, reporting and accountability around the money that we're given. The need to ring fence what is provided to us by our donors to do meaningful, long-term, important investigations in the public interest. To ring fence that against, you know, the sometimes frantic and hysterical need by the Mail and Guardian, who, you know, cut back and, you know, are short-staffed and don't have enough people to cover stuff. You know, for us to go out and, you know, just do a quick investigation on that, or, you know, can't you guys, you know, hook up something this week on that? You know, and, you know, Stefan and Sam have had to be really tough, and there are times when, you know, people don't look you in the eye in the office, you know, because they think you're kind of a shirker or a slacker, as, you know, someone clocks up their 5th straight story, you know, in 4 days that week kind of thing, elsewhere on the newspaper. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that our hope is that the donor-funded model is kind of a necessary holding position to get us through this catch-22 situation. But that with time, you know, as things become clearer about what the future is going to look like and how newspapers and journalists and publications will make their money in future, that, you know, we can kind of almost pull back the sort of shots in the arm in that sense. Just to finish off on the note of the fact that it's not all doom and gloom. There's actually some incredible opportunities presented by this kind of fragmentation and explosion of media into the digital space. Something that we are thinking about and actually actively fundraising now to do in the next 3 years is to harness the power of the mobile phone in everyone's pocket, you know, to distribute our investigative journalism in innovative and interesting ways. You know, amaBhungane is infamously known for the 4-page, 2,500-word blockbuster that you need like 3 panados and a cup of coffee to digest, right? You know, our idea is basically to kind of digest that down into bite-sized chunks, you know, and tweet stories, kind of tweet by tweet tell a story, and produce shorter versions of stories that are much more easily readable and disseminable, you know, on phones. And that way, you know, suddenly what was confined to anyone who can afford 35 Rand to buy the Mail and Guardian becomes, you know, a wonderfully broad kind of dissemination of the work that we do. And with a phone in everyone's pocket, you know, hopefully we have sources and basically citizen journalists at you know, just a click away. I'm going to stop there because I have super overrun my time, but lots more to say, and looking forward to Q&A later.
We'll move away from print and start focusing on TV and ETV, and also community radio. And you decide.
Firstly, what a privilege to be sitting here with you guys. I'm not even a journalist. I produce media, any media, radio, TV, print, doesn't matter. As long as we can get a message in there, we pretty much make it. Community Media Trust, at least. We work very heavily with the SABC. Heavily, what a word. And we've been producing Siangoma, which is a health television show, for 8 seasons. And the history of that is what's important, because in the beginning, when we were trying to make the show and advocate for ARVs to be in the public health sector, the SABC wouldn't touch us. So we were on ETV for 2 seasons, and then ETV started charging us per episode, as if we Coca-Cola, to be on TV, even though it was educational. And then eventually SABC took us on board, and we went there, even though Mantu was telling us to have garlic and olive oil. And then we fought with them. regularly. We didn't actually go to court, but we sued them. We delivered papers twice to stay on air. And now we have a very good relationship because the Minister of Health is saying all the right things, the policies are there, and we all believe that, you know, our health is supposed to be going the way it is. So we're still on next year, January. And we work very closely with the SNC, but it's a love-hate relationship. Hate relationship. There's a lot of influence coming from them. For example, silly things like it's a youth show about HIV, but don't talk about sex, please. You know, or it's a youth show about HIV, but we put it on at 1:30 in the afternoon when everyone's in school. So the fight continues all the time. But then CMT also does community media on all platforms. And community television has increased massively in the last 2 years. On DSTV, there's about 5 community television stations. We work with all of them. But they have their own issues. They've got financial problems, which also creates issues where any church or people selling vitamins can buy airtime on the CTVs. And you'll have hours and hours of airtime being bought, which doesn't really, the content is not good. Watch my words. So they're stuck in the situation where they're building an audience, but they don't have the money to create the content in a good way. So they end up taking anything that they can in order to fill those hours on television. And they've got lots of hours to fill. They get 3-year licenses, they're on DSTV, and there's just not enough good television being made for them to deal with it. Also, a lot of community television stations see independent producers as a way of making money, so they charge us in order to put things on television, which doesn't really work as a model. I think that's about it. Oh, and then radio as well. We do live radio, and the only way CMT can hold its independence on community radio is to buy the airtime. So if we want to do health messaging, we have to pay them. The minute we want to have a talk show with a DJ in there, whoever other sponsors they have climb into the show. So we ask our donors to give us money so that we can secure time on the radio station so that we can do our own programming. I think that's it. Thank you. Oh, and GroundUp. I forgot about you. GroundUp is our local news, community news website, which is actually only working in the Western Cape at the moment. But we have big plans to expand. And we're publishing daily now. We started publishing weekly. It's totally donor funded, and we're completely independent. And it's led by Nathan Devlin and Alide Dasnois. And we've got quite a few journalists now, haven't we? Like, more than the Cape Times. Yeah, and also it's a financial issue, but we kind of growing little by little, and we try to stay donor funded. The advertising thing, I mean, we advertised 1 or 2 NGOs for 500 rand a month on the website. It doesn't really work. I think we're going to steer clear of that now.
I suppose the question that we as OSF are interested in is, I think the challenge that Lionel has posed is what would be a new sustainable funding model? So what is the type of media we'd like to see in South Africa as we move to consolidate our democracy in the next 10 years? What is the type of journalism that we can rely on in 10 years' time, be it community, radio, TV, print, digital, etc.?
Thanks for that, it was very interesting. I'm just going to throw one question out. And I mean, it's going to be a little bit harsh, but at one level, I think it's been discernible, and some of the reasons have been outlined, that your average read every week in newspapers is getting worse. And it's really, I mean, if you look at this year, it's been a very poor year for South African journalism. We've had the Oscar frenzy, we've had examples of this Sunday Times printing this ridiculous story on an MP's birth certificate in Swaziland and saying they crack investigative team there. We've just seen this sort of deteriorating quality of reads. And then we had last year the city press, we had this sort of scandal around journalists who disagreed with the editor being sort of outed in public and sort of attacked, and all of these. Do you think there's, and also the city press, for instance, has been getting worse in my opinion. My question is, and another thing after that is, do you think there's a linkage between dropping circulation and the deteriorating quality of print publications? I mean, for instance now, I'm not going to spend whatever money on buying a Sunday paper when there's maybe 2 stories I want to read and I get them online. It's just not something you want to sit down for a few hours with. And maybe the core audience has been alienated in many of these cases because people think that if you make your content more online and edgy, you get people to read it. The second thing is, we talk a lot about media and print media, but we haven't talked about types of print media besides newspapers, which is magazines and that sort of thing, and journals. And one of the things that struck me, I mean, and part of what I've been researching, sort of past forms of media, is that our media array of diversity, I'm not even sure it's funding related, before '94 was a lot more diverse and interesting than it is now. We had several magazines, from labor and political magazines to sort of radical political publications and more grassroots publications. But suddenly it seems that all of these publications disappeared over the last 20 years. Now, why do we have such a, besides, I mean, the obvious issue, do they make money, such a small array of interesting publications besides newspapers? And I think it's a question worth asking.
Carrie and...
But I would be interested in the other panelists maybe saying how they would see South Africa's media landscape in 5 years' time. Because I don't know a single young person who buys a newspaper. They get it all online. It's not that they're not consuming news, but they're consuming it online. When Business Day tried to make people pay for subscriptions to the digital, they won't tell you the numbers. But I was told by somebody there they had less than 1,000 people subscribing. 750 was apparently what the figure was. So they just shut up about that. So that model is not working. People are not buying the digital product. The advertising, so it's going to Google, but it won't be going to our little website. So a digital platform, what is the future?
A very interesting panel discussion. I came expecting to hear much more about threats emanating from the state and influencing newsrooms. And with 1 or 2 exceptions, everyone's really focused on the influence of money and advertising and owners. Anton says that it's the game for advertisers and owners to try and influence editorial. And the real concern is about the use of public money for that. But I want to put it to the panel that in South Africa we have a crisis in our media that is historical. We've never had a media that's been able to service the diversity of our population. Our media has always been predominantly English speaking, predominantly speaking to urban issues. In the case of the private media, predominantly speaking to the concerns and prejudices of the middle class. The vast majority of South Africans have never had a free press that serves their interests. And I think that the question of the funding model is critical. And what we're hearing is that there are alternatives that are donor funded outside of the market. I'm not convinced, Fatima, that donors don't apply pressure. I'm sure amaBhungane's grant will have to be renewed at some point and may or may not be at your discretion. I think Lionel refers to the Nordic countries, where there are very interesting models of public funding, where taxpayers say, we're going to invest in our democracy. We're not going to put lots of money into helping mining corporations get their minerals to the port, which is where our government is currently funding massive public investment. Let's invest in our democracy. Let's invest in the diversity of media. And I think in the Nordic countries, there's some very good examples of how that can be done in ways that minimize the risk of political interference. It just strikes me that we need a bold vision, that this kind of crumbs of donor funding to create sparks of hope isn't going to resolve the crisis our democracy is in. The majority of South Africans feel alienated from our government and generally alienated, and if we don't resolve it through democratic, well-informed processes, we're going to resolve this conflict by other means, which I don't want to see.
I feel like what happened to Alide has really started a national conversation in bits and pieces. We're finally reflecting on how it is that media owners may be impacting on media freedom in a way that I don't think we were doing a year ago. But one of the quiet conversations that one is hearing is from journalists who have been bullied many times in the last few years and feels like they've had to suffer in silence. And so I want to put to the platform and maybe to the room that as people committed to media freedom, we need to recognize that there are many, many abuses that are happening in silence. Many, many abuses of journalistic freedom that aren't met with our solidarity. And to some extent, we need to be telegraphing to junior reporters, to reporters in forgotten newsrooms and Media 24 and Times Media Group, where I think that we are hearing very concerning stories as well. That we care about their freedom and that they have, I suppose, an obligation to speak up. Well, they don't have an obligation to speak up, but if they did, that we would be willing to listen.
Some issues we'd also like you to reflect on. The one is around whistleblowers and whistleblower protection and how difficult it is, given the current climate of assassinations, of attempted assassinations, of the number of whistleblowers around the country, and we're getting increasing reports of more and more attempts of assassination of key whistleblowers, particularly people who work in the state, reporting on state corruption. So how difficult it is to produce original content, independent journalism, if a key source of information is their lives are under threat. It's not just that their phones are being tapped. And I'm sure you all hear the clicks quite often on your phone. So I mean, we're not overreacting. This is a genuine threat. And then the second issue is whether you agree that, and I think Alide's dismissal prompted it, but whether you as a panel of experts agree that there has been a seismic shift. I think a lot of people working in newsrooms are saying that something has shifted considerably from last year, December, to early this year, February, and it's time for people to actually mobilize quite seriously, not just using donor funds, but a more radical kind of response to how we actually protect the right to information, where media is just one sort of vehicle to articulate it, right? And then finally, just your comments, I think linked to Mark's point earlier, is where is the MDDA in all of that? So we do have the public money, we are paying for media diversity, it's going to the MDDA. We're not quite sure where that money is going to, what media diversity it's actually funding, where the transparency is in that. And incidentally, the head of the MDDA has been shortlisted for the position of chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission. So if ever there was a possibility of country deployment, I think that process needs to be monitored quite carefully. It's the most bizarre thing, the head of the MDDA being shortlisted. None of you are shaking your heads in total shock. It's the most bizarre thing. So let's hear your views on that. We'll start with you choose.
So let me respond to what Kerry said about the future. I mean, you're quite right, it's not in newspapers. When the Star is down to 80-something thousand, and sadly here the Mail and Guardian is down lower than when I left, which was 15 years ago. It's not in newspapers. And the problem we have is that we're being failed by our media owners and managers in particular, because it's quite clear that you have to invest enormously in moving your audience to the internet and growing a new audience there, particularly in mobile. But if you look at the standard and quality, I think almost across the board, of traditional media sites, I think they're second rate, because there isn't investment going in. Because it's caught up in the whole cost cutting. So we're caught in this cost cutting spiral downwards, where it's affecting quality and therefore losing readers. And it's, if you look at the great examples, the New York Times and the Guardian, different models, but the point was they threw money at building the internet audience. I do want to say, though, that some of the most interesting writing in this country is being done by through internet sites that are not tied to traditional media. I think Daily Maverick, Africa's a Country, although that's run from the US, GroundUp, the con. Absolutely. I mean, the quality varies, but I think there's an interesting thing. To me, if you ask me who's the most interesting writer in this country at the moment, I'd say Sisonke Msimang, who one reads on those sites, not on the mainstream media. So that is where we have to build, where we have to create the space. It was technology that enabled the alternative press of the 80s. And it's technology that will enable the emergence again. You're not going to see the emergence again of magazines, of the proliferation we saw in that period, because they're in print. But you are hopefully going to see them on the internet. But it does require owners of vision to be prepared to throw money, as they've done at The Guardian and the New York Times. That will pay off eventually. And it's difficult and brave, particularly when you've overpaid for something like independent newspapers and you're hugely in debt. So it's to do with our ownership structures as well.
Can I pick up from there? I'm not sure if I'm holding this right. I think you are right that one of the reasons for the fall in circulation is the quality. It must be so. But maybe we should just revisit the conventional model of how print at least is supposed to work. There's supposed to be a virtuous cycle. You're supposed to have good journalism, which means you get lots of readers, you get lots of advertisers, that means you've got lots of money, that means you can invest in more good journalists, and so on and so on and so on. Now, obviously that's all come apart. I've just got a couple of questions that I'd like to throw out. Has it really come apart outside the first world? That I don't know. I know that in some African countries and in some Asian countries and in some Latin American countries, print is alive and kicking. Whether it's because it's in some way or another the link between print and digital has been better managed there or not, I don't know. But certainly print is not dead everywhere. It's not as dead everywhere as it is in the countries that we tend to look towards, which is the English-speaking first world. But if it is to die, print, in the form in which we know it, and digital is not really alive yet, nobody's found the way, not the Mail, and not the Guardian, not the New York Times, not Le Monde, and none of them have found the way yet, then we do have to look at a different form of ownership. And into the mix, I think you're quite right, that the Nordic recipe is definitely one to look into. In South Africa, that could have been the PIC. We have this enormous investor which manages the state pension fund. It's the biggest investor in the country. If it were to invest in the media, that's definitely an option, but it would have to be an investment with no strings attached. It would have to be an investment into a pool of some sort. But there's something else that I think we should throw into the mix, and that is ownership by staff and readers. It's worked elsewhere, at least temporarily. I'm not sure how well it works now at The Guardian. It worked at Le Monde for a while. There's an Italian newspaper, at least one, that was started like that, which I don't know if it's still thriving, but it thrived for several years. And I think South Africa is quite a propitious kind of climate for that. First of all, because it immediately brings diversity, by the very nature of who the readers would be. It immediately brings black empowerment by the very nature of who the readers would be. And I think the interests of readers and staff on newspapers coincide probably to a greater degree than the interests of staff and shareholders, for obvious reasons. So at Independent, before this takeover, long before this, the actual purchase by the new consortium, we did set up a staff trust with assistance from WASA, the Media Workers Association, and we approached the PIC actually, and they listened to us with quite considerable interest. We approached other investors also. They also listened to us with interest. The idea would have been to secure a 25% stake in the new independent newspapers for staff and eventually for readers. And it would have been held not by individual staff, which is also a formula to look into, but our formula wasn't that. Our formula was that the stake would be held for staff as a whole. So no one would actually make any money out of it, but any money that was put in, any money that was earned once the dividend flow started to heat up, as we hoped it would go towards training of journalists. So it didn't work, but it's one model. It could easily be put on the table again. So I think if we start from the perspective that there are public goods which the public doesn't buy, the Caxton Philharmonic Orchestra is another example. If you strictly apply market principles, there would be no Philharmonic Orchestra in Caxton because not enough people go to make it viable to pay the musicians. But many people think, well, there should be a Philharmonic Orchestra in Cape Town, and so it needs to be subsidized. If you think that news and information, and that's where I would differ slightly with Anton, because I think that good though they are, some of these sites like the Daily Maverick are all about opinion, and that what we really are missing in South Africa is information, facts, news. So if you think that that's important, then there must be a way to acknowledge that it's a public good and to have it funded as a public good, partly perhaps through donors, partly perhaps through the state, and I suggest partly through readers and or listeners and staff.
I personally feel very strongly that good journalism is good journalism, irrespective of whether it's digital, print, or what have you. And I think that no matter what happens going forward, the things that make good journalism, depth, insight, analysis, adherence to the facts, good writing, bold, daring, cunning approach to winking information, out of difficult places, that will continue to be relevant. And I think one of the wonderful challenges about being a journalist, and digital should not be seen as, the devil and then kind of taking away our, the family silver, is it's a great opportunity to relearn how to tell stories, and to keep those basic principles and tenets of journalism, but to tell things in different ways. That's my first point, and I think I'm kind of speaking to Mark's question here. What will the media landscape look like in 5 years' time? I predict that there won't be very many newspapers, but I think there will still be good journalism, and I think there will have been creative ways of doing that. Whether it's niche websites. A couple of ideas that we've kind of thrown around at amaBhungane is kind of almost like an investigative journalism wallet. amaBhungane stories, Noseweek stories, Sunday Times investigative unit stories, and similar like-minded kind of outlets and publications, could create a limited kind of, basically an offering, and a pay-per-read offering, and one that could be structured where the kind of device that you access that information on, it's costed according to that. So you could have your upper LSNs accessing it via the latest S11 by then or whatever. Paying higher rates so that the man in the street with his Nokia 001 can still access that, but it's a kind of a disaggregation, and it's giving the power to people to pick and choose what they want to read. A similar thing could be done either in combination or separately around the kind of rich, opinion-based, analytical stories that are doing the rounds, and that I'm sure people might be prepared to pay for as well. Which is not to say that I'm advocating that all content should be paid for forevermore. But those are just some of the ideas that I wanted to throw out in response to your question.
We've worked with the NVDA for many years, not any longer. Their mandate looks good on paper, but as an organization, they are incapable of running a grant of any kind, of any size. The red tape is ridiculous. And the input into what you are allowed to do and not allowed to do is they micromanage. Well, I can't even call it micromanage. You actually have to understand the project to do that. So this is it's ineffective. It doesn't work. And on their Facebook page, MDDA used our GroundUp TV project. They wore the T-shirts. They were so proud of it because they funded us, and they put on their Facebook page, brought to you by the ANC. It's not cool. This is a public forum, so it's safe to say I'm probably never going to work with the NVDA again. But that's okay.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
I do want to,
I think, it's very hard to have faith in our public institutions, but we have to. So when you talk about the media that's, the medium that does reach 90-something% of the population is the SABC. And it's exhausted us all with its endless antics, but we can't forget it, we can't drop it, we can't give up on it. And the same with the NDDA. The NDDA is an important institution because it's a model for the Norwegian-style subsidization. It just doesn't get enough money, and at the moment it doesn't even have a chief executive, so it's floundering around. But we do have to keep trying to fix these institutions because they are very important public institutions.
So mindful that it's 8:30, unless there's any other burning questions that just have to be asked, or we could do it over food and drinks. Yeah? Well, thank you all for coming.